Today, we're carrying on looking through the three angels' message. And we're going to cover the second part of the third angel's message that's found there in Revelation chapter 14. And we start here. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, "If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. And they have no rest day nor night who worship the beast in his image. And whosoever receiveth the mark of his name, here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." Now, as we looked at last time, this is the longest of the three messages. And it is the one that is the most strongly worded, with these warnings and judgments attached to it. Now, this here is sort of the heart of the message, divided into these four parts. Last time, we looked at the central parts, the warnings that God gives about the wrath of God and the torment, the fire and brimstone that is to come upon those that receive the mark. And we looked at why does this warning given so strongly, and what is God wanting to do? What's the response he wants from us? Today, we're going to start looking at the opening and closing, when it talks about if any man worship the beast and his image. And again, it closes for who worships the beast and his image. So that's what we're going to look at today. The first thing we're going to start at is which beast is this that it's warning us about? Because in the book of Revelation, there are several beasts mentioned. So the question of which beast? Is it the beast from the sea, the beast from the earth, the beast from the bottomless pit, or the beast that the woman rides at the end? Well, the first clue we're given is in the message itself. Okay, in Revelation 14, verse 9 and 11, we're told that the people worship the beast and his image. So straight off then, the beast is the one who has an image made of it. And this is in chapter 14. If we just jump back a chapter into Revelation 13, what John's just told us about, we find that this beast that comes up out of the earth, and we read this in Revelation 13, starting in verse 11. "And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon, and exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and caused the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed." So this beast that comes up out of the earth, it causes all the earth to worship the first beast. So the message we saw in Revelation 14 was a warning against worshiping the beast. And this earth beast isn't worshipped, but it told us it causes those to worship the first beast, referring back to the beast coming out of the sea that we're going to look at soon. But it carries on in verse 13. "And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had a wound by the sword and did live." So again, we're told here that this beast from the earth causes people to worship the first beast. So the worship is directed at the first beast. And also here, the image that is created is of the beast that had a wound with a sword and did live. That had this deadly wound and was healed. So now if we jump back to the beginning of chapter 13, we're going to look at this first beast and we're going to see how it's described. 13 verse 1 and 3. We read, "And I stood upon the sands of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy." And then in verse 3, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." So this is the first beast that the beast coming up out of the earth points worship back to. And this is the one that had the deadly wound and was healed. Okay, so the beast from the sea is the one that we just read about, had the image made of it, and the one that is worshipped. So this tells us that message, the third angel's message in Revelation 14, in verse 9 and 11, when it warns us about worshipping the beast and his image. The beast it is referring to is this beast from the sea, the beast in the first half of Revelation chapter 13. Now, when John sees this beast rising up out of the sea, he describes it. And its descriptions are very interesting. We're going to start looking at those now. Okay, so as we started reading before in verse 1, it says, he stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And then it carries on to describe it here. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. So this beast from the sea is described with these several characteristics. Okay, it rises up out of the sea, has 7 heads, 10 horns, like a leopard, feet like a bear, and a mouth like a lion. Now, when we look at all these features here, that they sound very familiar to many of us, I'm sure. If we're going to jump back to Daniel 7 and we're going to look at what the prophet sees there in his vision, and we're going to find that John is drawing on that. John is taking all this imagery straight from Daniel 7. As if when John is trying to describe this beast from the sea to us, this beast that has this image made from it, and all the world is worshipping it. He's telling us, go back to Daniel 7 and look there if you want to understand who this beast is. Because when we turn back to Daniel 7, we find this. In Daniel 7, verse 3, Daniel speaking, and he says, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. So first we have beasts rising out of the sea, which is what John saw in Revelation. In verse 4, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. So the beast rising out of the sea, it was a lion. And behold, another beast, the second like unto a bear. So we have beasts rising out of the sea, a lion and a bear. Then carrying on, it says, after this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon its back 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads. And finally in verse 7, it says, after this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible. And he goes on to describe how destructive this beast is, and finishes off by saying that it had 10 horns. So when we compare these, we find in Revelation, it's drawing from each one of these beasts, the beast rising up out of the sea. Okay, there was a lion, a bear, a leopard, and this 4th beast with 10 horns. John sees a lion, a bear, a leopard, and 10 horns. But he also says it had 7 heads. And that's interesting. If you go through the beasts here, they have a combined of them 7 heads. You've got the lion with 1, the bear with 1, the leopard with 4 heads, and then this last final terrible beast with 1 head. So John here is saying, go back to Daniel 7, understand Daniel 7. Okay, that is what this beast is rising out from. But the difference is, Daniel presents these 4 beasts, 4 different kingdoms that will arise. But when John describes it, he's describing a single beast, a single power, but with all the attributes of these beasts. It's the culmination of the powers in Daniel 7 that oppress and oppose God. Okay, Daniel's not describing any one of these beasts, but he's taken all the attributes of these powers that oppose God, that oppress people, that cause destruction, and he's saying, I'm talking about the culmination of all those powers in Daniel 7 that stood in opposition to God and oppressed his people. And one more interesting point to note before we move on is as Daniel goes through his prophecy and he describes a lion, a bear, a leopard, and this 4th beast. Okay, so he describes them in this order: lion, bear, leopard, 4th beast with 10 horns. But in Revelation, when John describes this beast to us, he does it in the opposite order. He describes the 10 horns and tells us it's like a leopard, a bear, and a lion. So he describes it in the reverse order that Daniel presents it in. It's like Daniel here is in the kingdom of Babylon in his day, and he's looking forward. And he's describing how these beasts will rise in the future, the order in which they will rise. But John here is standing in the 1st century, and it's like he's looking back, describing the order that he sees these kingdoms in history that have come. And so here we have Daniel standing at the beginning, the first of these kingdoms, describing forward. Daniel standing here at the time of the last of these kingdoms, the one with 10 horns, describing them backwards. So John describing them backwards in history as he's seen them. But the thing I want to notice here that I mentioned before, and I just want to emphasize before we move on, is Revelation 13 presents the culmination of the beast from Revelation 7. That the final power that is sort of all the oppression and the opposition to God, and these powers combined into this one final power. And because when we look at Daniel 7, none of these beasts are actually the final power that oppose God. We find that is represented as the little horn. And when we look at the little horn, so that's just, carrying on again, these different beasts as they go through. When we look at the little horn, we find it has many attributes defined about it that are the same as we see the beast doing in Revelation 7, because this little horn power is that culmination of evil that opposes God and oppresses his people. It's described as having a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. We find that in Daniel 7 and Revelation 13. It's ruled for 42 months, and a times and the dividing of times, or 3.5 years, which is 42 months. That same prophetic time period, the little horn and the beast in Revelation 13 both reign for. We're told that they make war with the saints and overcome them in both passages. That the beast lasts until the end and is destroyed by the divine judgment in both. So here in Revelation 13, that beast from the sea is the little horn of Daniel 7. So John is telling us, when he begins to describe this beast rising up from the sea, that this beast power that will be worshipped, that the world will wander after and will have an image made of it. He's telling us, go back to Daniel 7. He describes it in this way, telling us, this prophecy has already been presented in Daniel 7 to identify who this power is. Go back there and understand that. And then come back to Revelation 13, and I'll continue to expand upon this and give further light that God has revealed about this power. And so we're going to look here in Daniel to understand a bit about this little horn, and then we're going to take that back to Revelation 13 to give us a greater understanding of who this beast power is. But when we get into Daniel, the book of Daniel, Daniel 7 itself is actually parallel to a previous prophecy found in Daniel 2. Okay, Daniel 7 is presented as a parallel prophecy to Daniel 2. So to understand Daniel 7, we want to compare it to Daniel 2, and we see they're presenting the same thing. But in Daniel 2, the king Nebuchadnezzar is given a dream of this metal man, this statue, and each one of these body parts represents a different kingdom that would come. So we have the head of gold, which parallels with the lion eagle's wings, and we're told that represented Babylon. The chest of arms in silver parallels with the bear that was raised up on one side, representing the kingdoms of Media and Persia. The belly and thighs of bronze parallels with the leopard, which had 4 wings and 4 heads, representing Greece. The legs of iron represents this fourth beast with iron teeth in Daniel 7, and that is the kingdom of Rome. But when we come down to this last bit, dealing with the little horn, in Daniel 2, we have the feet and the toes of iron and clay. So we still have some of the iron from the legs, but this other element of clay is mixed in. And in Daniel 7, this parallels with the 10 horns from which the little horn emerges. So before we can identify this, we're going to start here, okay? What is this iron and clay mixed together in Daniel chapter 2? Because that forms the foundation of these 10 horns from which the little horn arises out of, and that tells us who this little horn power is, this beast of Revelation 13. Now, in Daniel 2, verse 41, we read when he's telling us about this dream the king had. He says, "And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay." So the first thing we're going to look at is, what does potter's clay mean? What does that symbol represent? We know the iron represents the kingdom of Rome. That was the legs of iron. That parallels with that fourth beast with iron teeth, and that is the iron monarchy of Rome. But what does potter's clay mean? Where is that revealed in the Bible? Well, if we turn to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 18, and we begin reading from verse 1. We read, "The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause thee to hear my words. Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he wrought a work on the wheel, and the vessels that he made of clay was marred in the hands of the potter. So he made it another vessel, as seems good to the potter to make." So this is what God showed Jeremiah. He says, go down there and look at the potter's clay, look at the potter working with it. And then he gives him this interpretation of what this meant. He says, "Then the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, O house of Israel, cannot I do with you as this potter, saith the Lord? Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hands, so are ye in my hand, O house of Israel." So here, when Daniel's seeing the potter's clay and the iron is Rome, but the potter's clay is the symbol used there in Jeremiah to represent God's people. Potter's clay is God's people when they're being molded and shaped by their maker. Okay, it's not always perfect, but they're able to be molded by God. He says, as the potter's clay is in the potter's hands, okay, so are you in my hands, O house of Israel. God's people are the potter's clay. So here in the prophecy, when we see that the head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly of fire of bronze, the legs of iron, and then it moves into the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, we have this new element introduced. There's still the iron of Rome, but the potter's clay is introduced. God's people are part of this new kingdom mixed with Rome. But one thing I want to notice here is at the beginning, he describes the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, as if they're two separate parts. Okay, you've got Rome on one hand and God's people on the other hand. There's two separate parts. But as he carries on, he talks that thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay. When these two separate parts are mixed together, it's no longer potter's clay, it's miry clay. Potter's clay is the clay that's able to be shaped by its maker. Miry clay is unfit to use, that the potter cannot use that to make anything. And so while at the beginning, God's people were separate from Rome, throughout this time, they became mixed with the iron of Rome, and the potter's clay became miry clay. Now we're just going to look at two passages that talk about miry clay. The first one is found in Psalms, chapter 40, verse 1-3. This is a psalm of David, and he's crying out to the Lord. He said, "I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. He brought me up also out of the horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock and established my goings. And he hath put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto our God. Many shall see it and fear and shall trust in the Lord." And so here in this psalm, David is praising the Lord for his salvation, from saving him out of that horrible pit of sin. Okay, and he speaks about the miry clay as being part of the horrible pit that he needed to be saved from. So here, miry clay represents the pit of sin that God needs to save us from. So in Jeremiah, we saw that potter's clay represented God's church when they were being molded by him and shaped by him. But miry clay represents the condition of sin in which we fall into without God and we need him to save us from. So in Daniel, when he sees this kingdom that was part of potter's clay and part of iron, okay, this kingdom that had these two parts separate, God's people were potter's clay. They were able to be shaped by him. But when they were mixed together, they became miry clay. They became sinful and the corrupt, to the point which the potter could no longer work with them. Now, a second passage we're going to look at is in Ezekiel chapter 47. In Ezekiel 47, he sees this vision of this river flowing out from the temple, flowing out to the lands around it. And I want to notice how it describes it here. Okay? In Ezekiel 47, we're going to pick this up at verse 7. He says, "Now, when I had returned, behold, at the banks of the river were very many trees on one side and on the other. And he said unto me, these waters issue out towards the east country and go down into the desert and go into the seas, which being brought forth into the seas, the waters shall be healed. So this is this river flowing out from the temple. Now, it talks about it flowing through the desert and flowing down into the sea. And wherever it goes, it brings life. Okay, there are trees growing up throughout the desert. And when it's talking about going down into the sea towards the east, that's the Dead Sea. The sea that is so salty that you can float in it. It's impossible to sink in that sea. But because it's so salty, it's impossible for any life to live in there. It's absolutely sterile. But it says when this water from the sanctuary flows through the desert, there it abounds with trees. When it flows into the Dead Sea, it will be healed. Okay, so there's this water from the sanctuary is flowing out, healing everything it touches and bringing life wherever it goes. And we carry on in verse 10. And it shall come to pass that everything that liveth, which moveth, whithersoever the river shall come, shall live. And there shall be a very great multitude of fishes, because these waters shall come hither, for they shall be healed. And everything shall live, whither the river cometh. And it shall come to pass that the fishes shall stand upon it from Engedi even to Engalim. They shall be a place to spread forth nets. Their fishes shall be according to their kinds, as the fishes of the great sea, exceedingly many. So if you remember, Engedi is the cave in which David hid when he was fleeing from Saul. That's up in the mountains by the Dead Sea. So what this is saying is that the Dead Sea shall be filled with life and with water from the cave in Engedi, which is quite high up in the mountains, right across to the other side. And it says it shall be full of so many fish, like the great sea. That's referring to the Mediterranean Ocean. He's saying this water will heal the Dead Sea and bring so much life that it will have as many fish as the Mediterranean Sea. And carry on in verse 12. And by the river upon the banks thereof, and on this side and on that side shall grow all trees for me, whose leaves shall not fade, neither shall the fruit thereof be consumed. It shall bring forth new fruit according to his month, because their waters, they issued out of the sanctuary. And the fruit thereof shall be for meat, and the leaves thereof for medicine. Now, this is an imagery we see from the tree of life in Revelation, but the thing I want to notice here is how much it is emphasized. This water heals everything it touches. Okay, the trees bring forth fruit that will never run out. Doesn't matter how much fruit you eat off the tree, it will never be consumed. Okay, there is so much life and blessings coming from this water of the sanctuary. But now I want to notice what it says in verse 12, that this water brings blessing and healing to everything. But in verse 11, we read, but the miry places thereof and the marshes thereof shall not be healed. They shall be given to salt. So again, it speaks of the mire as something that cannot be healed. Okay, this river flows through the desert and heals it. It flows into the Dead Sea and heals it. It gives an abundance of life wherever it goes. But it says the miry places and the marshes shall not be healed. So here, when we have at the beginning potter's clay and part iron, God's people that are able to be shaped and molded, that are following him, and the iron of Rome, two separate parts. But as this kingdom goes, they are mixed together, and God's people become miry clay. God's people become unusable by him. So corrupt and sinful the church becomes during this time once it mixes with Rome. Now, this happened in a little bit of the history here, coming up to the 4th century. From the close of the scriptures, okay, from the close of the 1st century, Christianity began to be persecuted throughout the empire. And this persecution carried on for almost just over 200 years. The Christians followed Christ. They refused to obey Rome. Okay, they refused to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. They refused to acknowledge the emperor as the representative of these pagan gods and to worship him. Okay, and because of that, Christianity was persecuted by Rome. But in 313 AD, Constantine The Roman Empire issued the Edict of Milan, which was the Edict of Tolerance, making Christianity a legal religion. There was ended persecution from Christianity, and they got freedom to exercise their religion. But this freedom came at a cost. And that cost was compromise. Over the next decade and a bit, the Christian church began to grow closer to the Roman emperor. And in 324 AD, that's the date when Constantine changed from being the representative of the sun god to being the representative of Jesus Christ. Okay, while he issued an edict of tolerance for Christians back here, and while he started adopting Christian practices, he was still the representative of the sun god right up until 324. Okay, and then he stood out of his position as being the representative of the sun god and said, now I'm becoming the representative of Jesus Christ here on earth. It was the same paganism, the same pagan idea that the emperor is head of that religion. Okay, that Christians refused to acknowledge throughout this, they were persecuted for. But now the Roman emperor, claiming to be Christianity's friend, simply switched his title from representative of the sun god to representative of Jesus Christ. And then the very next year, in 325, Constantine called the Christian bishops together for the Council of Nicaea, where they were to decide, the first ecumenical council deciding what Christianity would believe. And this creed was established as the Nicene Creed. Now, the thing I find interesting about this is this council was called by the authority of the emperor. The emperor of Rome called the church together so that they would decide what to believe under the authority of the Roman emperor. And so here we see the church transitioned from being persecuted to compromising and being mixed with Rome. There was no longer a separate identity from Christianity to the Roman Empire. It was this Roman Christian alliance here. And so the church went from being potter's clay to being miry clay in this transition period. Now, interesting to note, we also see this transition in the book of Revelation. We're not going to get into a lot, but I'm just going to mention it here. In the seven churches, at the beginning, they represent different periods in Christian history from the apostles, when the book of Revelation was written, right up to the second coming. And the first three we read about is the church of Ephesus. Around that first century was the apostolate church. Then the church in Smyrna deals with the church under its period of persecution. It's 200 and a bit years of persecution suffered under the Roman Empire, when the church was in its potter's clay, when it was pure. But then in the church of Pergamos, we have this transition when the church began to be compromised. And I find that interesting, that the transition from the persecuted church to the compromise, that this transition when that potter's clay began to be miry, began to be mixed with Rome, that centered around Constantine becoming the Christian emperor, and then calling together the Council of Nicaea, which the church officially adopted the Trinity as the foundation of the Catholic faith. And that is the point, that it's just a transition period where the church began to be miry. So here in Daniel 2, we're told about this feet and the toes of iron and clay. And it tells us about this transition of God's people uniting with Rome and becoming corrupted. And it is of this background of these feet and toes of iron and clay, of this corrupted Christianity, of this Roman Catholic faith that was mixed together. That is the foundation of where we understand the little horn rising from among these 10 nations, these 10 horns. And so now we're going to jump into Daniel 7. With the background here provided in Daniel 2, we're looking for a little horn to rise out among 10. And that's 10 is this kingdom here. That is this Christian Roman alliance that has been corruption of God's people. Now, the 10 horns that are presented here, the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire. Rome over time began to break apart and splinter with political infighting, with invasions from different Germanic tribes. Okay, they've eventually split into these 10 kingdoms. Some of them are today. You recognize that the Franks, the French, the Alemanni, the Germans, the Visigoths, Spains, the Serbi, the Portugal, Anglo-Saxons, England, the Lombards, the Italians, and the Burgundies, Switzerland. Okay, now these were the rough divisions. Further wars and stuff further defined political borders, but those are 7 of those kingdoms that are still with us today. But these last 3 that arose from the division of Rome, the Ostrogoth, the Heruli, and the Vandal, they don't exist anymore today. And we're going to look at those a little later, because the horn's speaking of uprooting 3 of them. Okay, so this little horn arises from among these 10 divisions. Okay, and so we're looking from among these divisions of Rome, a power to arise from this clay and iron mixture. And we see that with the papacy. Historically, the papacy arose from this union of the church and state. And it arose from among these 10 tribes. Now, something else Daniel 7 tells us is that this kingdom is diverse from the first. It's diverse from the other horns. And the thing that made the papacy a different power, a different entity from these other kingdoms, is they are all state powers, but this is a religious power. And this is something that is new, not just for Rome, but largely unseen, because most of the time, the king was the head of the religion. Just like with Constantine, went from being the representative of the sun god. When he became Christian, he went to being the representative of Jesus Christ. So it was the state power that was the head of the religion. It was the king that was the chief priest. And this is how it was through a lot of countries, a lot of religions. But this next power that arose is different from all those that came before it. It's different from all these other horns, because it is a religious power, a church power that claims authority over the states. And we're told that it looked more stout than its fellows. Now, the word stout is one that we don't really use anymore. It's not really that common. But when we looked at what it's translated from, it's translated from this word rab, that's a Strong's number. And it means captain, chief, great, lord, master, stout. That's how it's translated. So I'm saying he's more stout, he's more chiefly, he's more great, he's more pompous, more exalted than the others. And there is many evidences of this, from the investiture controversies to when it was the Pope that appointed Charlemagne as the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. It was the Pope that appointed emperors. But one point I will look at comes with the title of the Pope, or one of his titles. Now, this comes from a book, The Enduring Vision. I just want to notice, I'm just going to follow through some of the history here. In 487 BC, 50 years after the Persians conquered Babylon, the Chaldean sun worshippers were compelled to flee Babylon because of Persian hostility. They moved westward and established their center in Pergamos, independent of Persian control. So the Babylonian sun worshipping cult, this religion of the Chaldeans in Babylon, that Babylonian religion had to flee. And it went to Pergamos and established its new center of religion in Pergamos. Now, the head of the religion of this Babylonian sun cult, its title was Pontifex Maximus. And so that religion was taken from Babylon to Pergamos. And we carry on. The Pergamene king embraced the Babylonian religion and assumed its leadership under the Babylonian title of Pontifex Maximus, or chief pontiff. And so this religion was taken from Babylon to Pergamos, and it became the official state religion of Pergamos, with the Pergamum king being the head of the religion under the title Pontifex Maximus. Then in 133, the kingdom of Pergamon was given to the Romans with all its official titles, religious and state. And so we read that Julius and Augustus Caesar were the first to assume the title Pontifex Maximus. Later, the Christian emperor Gratian rejected the title, whereupon it was assumed by Pope Damasus, and has ever since been one of the official titles of the Bishop of Rome. Now, I find this is an interesting transition from the religion of Babylon, went to Pergamos, became the official state religion of Pergamos, with the king holding the title of Pontifex Maximus. Then that title got transferred to Rome, Pontifex Maximus. That was the same title Constantine kept. And why he gave up his identity as the representative of the sun god, he actually kept the title Pontifex Maximus, kept the title of the head of the Babylonian cult. And this was carried through until the emperor Gratian rejected that title. He didn't want the title as the head of the Babylonian cults, of these pagan cults. But as soon as he rejected it, the Pope took that title for himself. The Pope claimed the title that was previously emperors and kings, the title of the head of these Babylonian religions that had been passed down to Pergamon and then to Rome, and now to the Catholic Bishop of Rome. We also read in Daniel 7 that before him, this is before this little horn, 3 of the other horns were uprooted. And we saw that here, these 3 horns, the Ostrogoth, the Huruli, and the Vandals. Now, these 3 have something very interesting in common. We looked at when Rome and the Catholic faith first started mixing together at that Council of Nicaea, when the emperor called it to settle this controversy, this Arian controversy, and the church officially adopted the Nicene Creed, this Trinitarian formula. Now, that was the foundation of the Catholic faith. But the problem was these 3 nations rejected that. So this little horn could not rise to prominence. It could not exert its authority over this emperor, this empire, when 3 of the nations completely rejected the foundational doctrine that gave it its authority. They rejected its authority. They rejected the church in its miry state. And so these 3 Arian nations had to be uprooted before the little horn could rise to power into its prominence and rule for its 3.5 prophetic years. So the next thing we read in Daniel 7:25, it says, the saints were given into his hand for a time and times and the dividing of time. Now, let me read here about a time. That's a way that the Hebrews would refer to a year. What one time it took the earth to go around the sun. Times, plural, being 2 years, and the dividing of times. If you cut a year in half, 6 months. So we've got 3.5 prophetic years. Okay, so the saints were given into the hands of this little horn for 3.5 years. This little had this reign of terror that lasted 3.5 years. It began when the last of those Arian kingdoms were destroyed. Because when that happened, there was now no kingdom in the empire that was standing against the authority of this little horn, against this papal system. So it had this reign that began from that time. Now, one thing we do need to look at is this is 3.5 prophetic years. Okay, but throughout Daniel 7, we've seen lions, bears, eagles' wings, terrible beasts, little horns. These are all prophetic symbols, and we have to know how to interpret these, how to understand these to apply them to literal things. Now, there are 2 passages where we look at where we try to understand the prophetic time. Now, the first here in Numbers 14, verse 34, Numbers 14, verse 34, is speaking, and it says, after the number of days in which you searched the land, even 40 days, each day for a year shall you bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and you shall know my breach of promise. So here, God is speaking to the children of Israel. They went into the promised land to search it out for 40 days. And when they came back, they rebelled against God and wanted to go back to Egypt. So God sent them to wander in the wilderness 40 years. He says, a day for a year. And so in this prophetic context, he's prophesying to them and he's saying 1 day equals 1 year. Okay, what one literal day that you search the name equals a prophetic year. So we have this a day for a year period. And here in Ezekiel, in another prophetic context, we read, and when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. So there are many places in the Bible where we find parallels between a day and a year, but these two stand out as being significant as they're both given in a prophetic context. So when we come to the book of Daniel and even Revelation, we want to understand these prophetic times. We have to understand them within the context that the Bible gives to us. A day equals a year. So 3.5 prophetic years is 1,260 prophetic days. That is a day for a year, means 1,260 prophetic years. And now, as we look, this time period started when the last of those Aryan nations were uprooted before the papacy, so its authority could be put over all the empire. Now, and another part to that in 538 is found in the Code of Emperor Justinian. This is a codified set of laws that Justinian made. Some of them were in effect previously and were just compiled together. But these laws were given to the emperor, and those 3 Aryan nations, again, were resisting them. Okay, it was only when the last of those kingdoms could be uprooted and destroyed that the Code of Justinian could go into effect. And we're going to read a little bit about what it said. Now, it's a long set of codes, but we find this in the Code of Justinian, Book 1, Title 1, Paragraph 1. This is the very first line of the Code of Justinian's laws that he has issued to his empire. We read, we desire that all people subject to our benign empire shall live under the same religion that the divine Peter, the apostle, gave to the Romans, and which the said religion declares was introduced by himself, and which it is well known that Pontiff Damasus and Peter, the Bishop of Alexandria, a man of apostolic sanctity, embraced. That is to say, in accordance with the rule of apostolic discipline and the evangelical doctrine, we should believe that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit constitute a single deity, endowed with equal majesty and united in Holy Trinity. So this is the Code of Justinian. This is the opening line, the opening paragraph of the laws of Justinian that he put into effect, and could only be enforced throughout the empire once those last of the Aryan nations were destroyed, because it says that the entire world should be united under the one religion that is set forth as believing the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit constitute a single deity endowed with equal majesty and united in Holy Trinity. Now, I find it interesting when we looked at the potter's clay becoming miry clay, okay, in that 313 to 325 period in this transition when the church united with Rome, okay, that was over in the Council of Nicaea, the formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, when this little horn was rising to power, we find again that the state issuing laws forcing all nations to be united under this doctrine of the Holy Trinity. But the code carries on, Justin carries on to say, we order all those who follow this law to assume the name Catholic Christians and consider others as demented and insane. We order that they shall bear the infamy of heresy. He carries on, let no place be afforded to heretics for the conduct of their ceremonies, and let no occasion be offered them to display the insanity of their obstinate minds. This is the wording that goes out that gives the Catholic Church's authority to rule, okay? In the Code of Justinian in 538, he carries on. Let the observance of the Nicene Creed, recently transmitted by our ancestors, be firmly established by the testimony and practice of divine religion. Always remain secure. And then he goes on to clarify the Nicene Creed and to quote from it. And he says, these things indeed do not require further proof and should be respected. In other words, the doctrine of God as established in the Nicene Creed does not require any further proof. We are to believe it because the church creed says it, and it is not to be challenged. He carries on. Let those who do not accept these doctrines cease to apply the name of true religion to their fraudulent beliefs, and let them be branded with their open crimes, and having been removed from the threshold of churches, be utterly excluded from them. As we forbid all heretics to hold unlawful assemblies within the cities. If, however, any seditious outbreak should be attempted, we order them to be driven outside the walls of the city with relentless violence. And we direct that all Catholic churches throughout the entire world shall be placed under the control of the Orthodox bishops who have embraced the Nicene Creed. So this is the opening title in the Code of Justinian that he compiled and put into effect. Okay, this is the law that it established the Catholic Church as the dominant religion, as the one religion under the doctrine of the Trinity. And this could only go into effect after the last of those three Arian nations was rooted up. There was no more empire or kingdom throughout the empire that could oppose the authority of the Catholic Church, and thus the little horn began its rise to power in 538. And this continued right up into the end of the 1260 years in 1798, when the Pope was taken captive by the French general and sent into exile. And that fulfilled what we read in Revelation 13, verse 10, speaking of that little, the beast, which is that little horn power. He that leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. Just like for those 1260 years, that little horn, this beast from the sea, persecuted, led into captivity and killed with the sword. So at the end of that time period, it had its deadly wound healed. The Pope was taken into captivity and sent into exile. Daniel 7 continues to describe this little horn power to us. It says he made war with the saints and prevailed against them. Now, the atrocities and the persecutions of the papacy, of the Catholic Church throughout the ages, the persecutions against the Waldenses, the Inquisitions, the different wars they fought. It's hard to estimate how many Christians were killed by the Catholic Church during those periods. Estimates range from 50 million to 100 million. There's no way to be sure exactly, but as someone once said, by the time you're counting deaths in the tens of millions, you've made your point already. And that is what this power, it persecuted the saints. Okay, it fought against them, it fought against Christians to kill them, those who rejected its authority and its teaching. We read it's also described as having a mouth speaking great things, speaking blasphemies. And again, there are many examples, but I'm just going to provide one here from Pope Leo's encyclical. He says, "We hold upon this earth the place of God Almighty." Now that is a great blasphemous boast to make. And Daniel 7 says the little horn will make boasts like this. And history showed us that the papacy is the one speaking these great things. Again, it thinks to change times and laws. And the best example of this is the Catholic Church claim to have changed the Sabbath, the day of worship, to Sunday. We find this in a Catholic Universal Bulletin. Okay, it says the Roman Catholic Church changed the observance of Sabbath to Sunday by right of the divine infallible authority given to her by her founder, Jesus Christ. So this is the Catholic claims that they can change the law of God, that they can change the times that God has put to worship. Okay, so they speak great boastful things. They claim to change times and laws. It's described as the horn had eyes like a man. Now it's described as having eyes like a man and a mouth like a man. Okay, eyes is representing, it's seeing, it's understanding, and mouth is speaking and teaching. Okay, this power claims to have wisdom and to be able to guide and teach others. But its wisdom does not come from God, but from the traditions of man. And finally, the little horn is described as being destroyed by the judgment and then slain and burnt in the fire. Okay, and we find this same thing in Revelation with the beast, that beast from the sea. is destroyed in the fire. Here in Revelation 19, verse 19 and 20, this is dealing with the second coming of Christ. Okay, it says, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his armies. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before them, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. So that little horn that is described as being destroyed by the judgment, destroyed in the burnings, is happening here at the second coming of Christ. He has his deadly wound in 1798 when his power is taken away, but he continues until the second coming when he is destroyed in the fire. And now we talked about the churches in Revelation, okay? And there was this transition period between the persecuted church to the compromised church, okay? And that transition period was between that Edict of Milan that gave the church its freedom, but then it compromised to unite with Rome and became miry by the Council of Nicaea when it adopted the Trinity. Now, the next church, the Church of Thyatira, that deals with this apostate church, is this time period that starts in 538 and goes through to the Reformation. And that's one thing I find interesting, this period of transition. Okay, we're told in Thyatira that God gave them a chance to repent. When the church became corrupted and began to compromise, God gave them a chance to repent. But when they fully apostatized, and in 538, when they began this reign of the little horn power to persecute God's people and to fight against them, we enter into that next time period. And again, we're not going to go into this in depth. I just thought I'd mention that because it's an interesting point to make for further study. Now, with that in mind, we're going to jump back to Revelation 13. So just to summarize what we've got from the book of Daniel. Daniel 2 tells us of this time when God's people would unite with Rome and would become corrupt and become compromised to the point where he can no longer use them. They would become miry clay. And from this miry clay, this Roman Christian power, the Roman Catholic Church, this little horn would arise. This papal power would arise that would persecute God's people, would wear out the saints, and would do all these things. And here in Revelation 13, he starts by describing this beast coming up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, like a leopard, feet like a bear, mouth of a lion. He's telling us that power from Daniel, that little horn power, is the one we're talking about here. The beast from the sea is that papacy, the Roman Catholic power. And so he carries on. And he said, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw the beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his 10 horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And then we read, and the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. Now the dragon is we're told who that is in the previous chapter, in Revelation 12, verse 9. We're told, and the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. So this dragon that gave the papacy his power, seat, and authority is Satan. Okay, Satan gave his power to the papacy, his seat to the papacy, and great authority to the papacy. Now, what I'm saying can sound very harsh, that I'm saying Satan is the one that gave this power to the Catholic Church, to the Roman papacy. But I want us to make the point. I want us to understand that these are not my words. This is the Bible's words. This is what the scripture is telling us. When God warns us about worshiping the beast and his image in that third angel's message and gives us this very strong warning, he wants us to know who he's talking about. And John here tells us who he's talking about. He tells us, go back to Daniel 7 to understand that little horn power. The Daniel 2 tells us about the miry clay. Daniel 7 tells us about the little horn. And John here is saying that is this beast power that Satan rose up and established. Okay, this is Satan's church. This is Satan's power. He gave it his power, seat, and great authority. And he carries on. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wandered after the beast. Now, as we saw that that little horn, it had its deadly wound at the end of that 1260 years, okay, when the French general took the Pope into captivity and exile. That's what we read at the end of, Revelation 13, when it says, he that taken into captivity will be taken into captivity. He that kills with the sword will be killed with the sword. That power that ruled, that persecuted the saints, was itself dealt a deadly wound with the sword. But its deadly wound was healed. And so we here with us until the end of this world, where it is destroyed at the second coming of Christ. And all the world wandered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? So this beast, power that goes out, the papacy, okay, it's going out to the world. The world is wandering after it, and it's telling us that when the world is following the beast, when the world is following the papacy, they are worshipping the dragon. They are worshipping Satan. Satan is in the world to worship him through the actions of the papacy. And not only do they worship him, it says the beast itself receives worship. How? We're told here that people are saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? They're speaking about this beast is so great, no one can resist it. Who is able to make war? Who is like the beast? Okay, the system is so powerful and so universal, you can't resist it. You might as well join it. And so all the world wanders after the beast. Carry on in verse 5 and 6. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell therein. Now, a lot of this is what we saw in Daniel 7 with that little horn, a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. We saw that with the little horn. He continued 42 months. That's 3.5 years. It's got the same time period there. And again, open mouth to blaspheme God. Okay, so they're saying there's great things that the little horn, this beast, is speaking. Carry on in verse 7 and 8. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindred and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So again, just like we saw with the little horn, it makes war with the saints and overcomes them. It's persecuting them, okay? The same thing we saw, the same thing that's written in the pages of history. And it says, all the world, all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Now, this is the description that John gives us when he presents to us this beast. He points us back to the book of Daniel. He says, understand that little horn. Okay, understand that miry clay. That's who I'm talking about here. That's what the third angel's message warns us about, or one of them. It's the beast and his image that we'll look at next time. But right here, we've identified the beast. It is the papacy, okay? And that is the power that all the world was wandering after. But I want to notice this last line. It says, all the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And I love that last line there, because often when we just look at the book of Revelation, you know, the description of this beast, it's persecution, it's blasphemies, it's reign of power, it's inspiration from Satan. It can be very easy to get drawn away and to distracted by all this negative imagery and language. But John here brings us back. He tells us there's this power, this beast is powerful. Yes, it is violent. Yes, it is deceptive. Yes, it is global. But it cannot control everything. There is a way to be safe from this beast power. And the way to be safe, the only way to be safe, is not our knowledge of it. It's not our understanding of prophecy. It's not our determination to resist and to not submit to its authority. The only way to be safe from this beast power is to have your name written in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world. It's by the blood of Christ to cover us. And when his blood covers us, when his name is written in the book of life, we are safe with him. As Jesus said, that the deceptions that would come upon the world would be so convincing that if it were possible, it would deceive even the very elect. Unless we are part of God's elect, unless our names are written in that book of life, unless we are covered by the blood of the Lamb, we will be deceived. And so when we look at these end time events, God wants us to know who these players are that he's talking about, who these powers are. Okay, what is it that they're doing? What is their deceptions? Okay, he wants us to know what they are. But whenever he tells them, he always highlights the only way to be safe is not in our knowledge of the beast, but in our relationship with Christ. And that's why the third angel's message, when it tells us to not worship the beast in his image or receive his mark in our right hands or in our foreheads, it finishes in verse 12, Revelation 14, verse 12, with this statement. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. God's warning the world, all of us, about this power. But when he does that, he tells us that the saints, the patience of the saints, are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. This keeps them safe, their connection to God and Christ.